today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the most recent kind of research that we've done. As Rob mentioned, I'm the APAC CTO, and within Rapid7, the CTO function actually sits within our Rapid7 Labs organization. And so that's quite an interesting kind of place to put the technology function under the research team, because research is really answering the why. Why do we do what we do? Why do we create and focus on the technology that we focus on? It's really about responding to the threat landscape and to what we see out there. So we'll talk a little bit about the threat landscape. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some predictions. Predictions is always a bit of a challenging thing, but I'm going to talk about 3 areas that we think we will continue to see certain challenges, and then how we're going to address some of those things with Rapid7 across our technology portfolio, specifically around exposure management and detection and response. So with that, I just wanted to talk about Rapid7 Labs very briefly. Okay, so there's really 4 key functions to the Rapid7 Labs organization. The first, of course, is to develop new research. That research goes into all of the different products and technologies that we offer, including things like vulnerability signatures, things like threat signatures. So we're building research into our product. Why do we do this? Fundamentally, to help our customers and our partners to make better decisions, right? The reality is that there is a huge amount of information, there's a huge amount of telemetry. All we're really trying to do is understand what we need to focus on first. So that prioritization is really important. The third mission for Rapid7 Labs is to contribute back to the cybersecurity community. The bad guys collaborate all the time, and we as an industry need to do a better job of collaboration. And so, as Rob mentioned, we are involved with a number of very well-known, very widely used open source technologies. Again, Metasploit and Velociraptor. If you're not familiar with those technologies, I would urge you to have a look, download them for free, test them out. Also, there is a crowdsourcing website called AttackerKB. AttackerKB is basically our database of known vulnerabilities and known exploits. So a very, very important source of threat intelligence for all of you. And then finally, what we're trying to also understand is the cybersecurity health of the incident in general. So we do a lot of kind of open source, broad research across different sorts of security projects, open data where we publish this research, Project Lorelei, our honeypot network, and of course a lot of different threat research that I'll share with you today. So with that, let's have a look at a recap of the landscape in 2024. So 2024 was a very, very busy year. It was a very, very active year for threat actors. Of course, we saw a lot of APT activity, advanced persistent threat groups, that were predominantly targeting different governments, different critical infrastructure, large organizations around the world from an espionage point of view. On top of that, we continue to see, for example, a convergence of some of these nation-state attackers and financial crime groups. So the Lazarus Group, as an example, very, very well-known North Korean advanced persistent threat group. Just last week, they made the biggest theft of cryptocurrency to date. I don't know whether anyone read about this, but they stole about $1.4 billion from a crypto exchange called Bybit, and that kind of goes straight back into, I guess, the state. Other groups that we've heard of, Assault Typhoon has been very, very active in the telecommunications sector, basically targeting telcos all around the world, including in. And so we continue to see a lot of these sorts of highly significant groups. But interestingly, the ways in which a lot of these groups get into an organization, as Rob mentioned, doesn't necessarily need to be very sophisticated. Of course, they're using zero-day threats, but on top of that, we continue to see that remote access without MFA is one of the most common ways in which attackers get into an organization, followed by vulnerability management or vulnerability exploitation, followed by social engineering. Now, these numbers do kind of change, but broadly, those are the main ways that attackers get in. But I think we'll start to see a little bit more social engineering as a result of AI, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Why is all of this happening? Why is the problem increasing? Well, the problem is increasing because we as defenders are constantly having to shift our focus because our networks and our environments are changing all the time, right? When we think about innovation, when we think about the need for our companies to grow, what that basically means is that they need to adopt new technology, whether that's cloud technologies, whether that's AI, whether that's new tools like IoT devices. All of these things contribute to what we call the attack surface, which basically means more from a cybersecurity perspective that we need to defend against, right? So these are some of the challenges. But we spoke about APT groups, but I think that most organizations are probably more concerned about ransomware within the private sector. So what does ransomware look like across 2024? Again, a very, very busy year for ransomware. These are the various groups that Rapid7 tracks throughout the year. It's very hard to read, but you can kind of see that there's a lot of activity through the months. One of the most prolific groups is the one at the bottom, a group called Ransom Hub. They really only came into the picture last year from February, but they have been one of the most successful ransomware groups to date. And so some of the statistics that you can see, we tracked about 6,000 different sort of ransomware operations, but that is a underrepresentation of what actually goes out there because quite often organizations don't report that they have been ransomed. The number of active ransomware groups has actually decreased. So a couple of years ago, that number was around about the 200 to 300. That's actually come down to about 75 active groups and 45 at any one time. Why is that the case? It's because these 75 groups have been very, very successful, right? And so because they've been so successful, they've been generating the majority of the profits. They've been attracting the most attention. So that's why that number of groups is shrinking because of consolidation. What has been quite interesting, I think, is the average ransomware payment. So the average ransomware payment in the third quarter of last year was about $500,000 US, right? That's pretty huge. The median ransomware payment is about $200,000. So the majority of organizations pay about $200,000 US when they do pay the ransom, but on average, it's a much higher number because we have situations like the Change Healthcare ransom, where they paid about $22 million. So some of these ransom payments do go into the millions, but on average, most organizations are paying about $200,000, which is still a fairly significant number. If you are interested in terms of what some of these ransomware leak sites look like, I've got a couple of examples there. The top one is for Lockbit. So what they do is on a regular basis, they will just dump data for the different organizations, and I've kind of redacted the names of those companies, but if you don't pay the ransom, the data goes out there. The one at the bottom, another fairly active group in Asia called Babuk. They've just changed the name to Bjorka Babuk Ransomware. And it's quite interesting. They don't call themselves ransomware groups, they call themselves pen testers and also auditors, right? And they do kind of call out, some organizations that they're targeting, including healthcare, critical infrastructure, finance, and the like. So that's kind of a little bit about what's happening from a ransomware perspective. So let's talk a little bit about predictions. I'm really going to focus on three key areas that we think are going to continue to be a challenge. And the first is, we certainly think that there is going to be a continued escalation in ransomware activity. Why? Because the ransomware business fundamentally is a one-sided business model, right? It's all it's all reward, very little risk for them. Now, things are changing. What we started to see over the last couple of years is that a lot of law enforcement has gotten involved. Interpol, US DOJ, they put certain sanctions on a lot of these ransomware groups and ransomware operators. So things are changing, but fundamentally, it's still a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. The other reason why this is probably not going to go away anytime soon is because that ecosystem of ransomware groups is becoming a lot more sophisticated, a lot more specialized, right? You are not dealing with just one ransomware operator anymore. In fact, the ransomware operators have kind of moved to become more like software groups, software houses. They develop the ransomware, but they don't actively target the organizations. It's these sorts of affiliates, right? These individuals and these specialized groups that are targeting your organizations. And they're working with other groups like initial access brokers who are basically selling access to your companies. They're working with exploit brokers who are selling 0 days and vulnerabilities, exploited vulnerabilities to the ransomware affiliates to be able to work together to then gain access to your organization and to ransom your data. From a monetization point of view, we also see some changes in this area. In the old days, ransomware, as the name suggests, was about encrypting your data, right? It encrypts your data, they sell you back the decryption key, but increasingly as organizations are getting better with the backup and recovery, they've moved to double extortion, triple extortion, sometimes quadruple extortion. What that means is that they may or may not encrypt your data, but they will certainly steal a copy of your data and try and sell it back to you, right? If you don't want to pay for that, maybe they'll go after the victims of the data that it actually kind of belongs to. And again, if they can't do it that way, then they might auction that data to other third parties. So all of the data that is stolen that you may not pay, they will then sell as, again, initial access and for phishing purposes to other sort of criminals out there as well. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of monetize this data. And the other trend that we're seeing is that these ransomware groups tend to move around quite a lot. In the old days, a couple of years ago, there were these kind of massive groups, groups like Conti and Lockbit, Blackbuster, but increasingly, it's not popular to be some of these large groups anymore because that gets a lot of attention, right, from law enforcement. And so we start to see that these groups kind of splinter off into smaller operations, but as a result of that, they're becoming a lot more aggressive. So we've started to see hospitals, for example, get targeted. We've started to see critical infrastructure get targeted. Industries where previously there might have been some ethics against it, but these kind of smaller, more aggressive groups are going after everyone. And also a really important trend is that ransomware is also kind of moving its way down in terms of the size of the organizations getting targeted. So they started with kind of the $100 million and above revenue organizations. They're now kind of moving down to the 20 to 30 million. And the most common organizations that get ransomed are organizations with about $5 million worth of revenue or turnover, right? Because these organizations that they feel have probably less resources to spend on cybersecurity, but still have valuable data that the ransomware groups will steal and try and ransom back. So some interesting stats there. The second trend, and we spoke a little bit about this, but the attack surface is going to continue to be targeted, right? When we think about things like public cloud adoption, when we think about things like AI and new applications, all of these are just going to contribute to a bigger surface that you need to defend. And as a result of that, attackers are going to find different ways to try and get into the organization. What we saw in the last 12 to 24 months is this third point here, which is actually quite interesting. Network edge devices, these are things like your firewalls, these are your routers, your file transfer applications, all of your VPNs. These are the things that are getting targeted the most. Why is that? Well, first of all, of course, they're exposed. And secondly, these are also the appliances that you're probably not monitoring. It's very hard to put an EDR agent onto a firewall or a router, right? Attackers know this. That's why they're going after these devices. And no large firewall vendor is immune. We see 0-day vulnerabilities against these devices all the time. So again, I would urge you to really focus on those network edge devices. But even in terms of general vulnerabilities, right? As Rob mentioned, that number has grown from about 28,000 in 2023 to over 40,000 in 2024, right? And if you're focusing just on the critical and the high-risk vulnerabilities, that's still about 40% of all of those vulnerabilities. It's gotten so bad that NIST, which is the US organization responsible for enriching CVE information and assigning CVSS criticality, had a backlog of 93% by May last year. So by May last year, they couldn't keep up, right? And they've only just started to clear the backlog. So for about, 6 to 8 months, a lot of the new CVEs didn't even have vulnerability scores against them, right? So if your strategy for vulnerability management is focusing on CVSS severity. There are gaps with that strategy. And then finally, we get asked all the time about AI. Is AI use going to increase from a threat actor point of view? My answer is maybe, right? Because we haven't actually seen that many sophisticated attacks. Yes, we hear about deepfakes, and yes, we hear about vishing, and these are quite interesting. They are quite sophisticated, but we don't see the really novel, the really innovative ways that attackers can potentially use AI. Why is this, right? And we think there's a very simple reason. And the reason is necessity drives innovation, and the bad guys don't need to innovate, right? We've already spoken about the fact that things like stolen credentials, things like vulnerability exploitation, things like phishing, these aren't sophisticated attacks, but they're still working really, really well. And so while there are ways in which attackers can use AI, there's no need for them to do that at the moment. Where it might change, though, is we've started to see, especially this year, things like DeepSeek, which has brought down the cost of AI. We're starting to see reasoning models. We're starting to see agentic AI, right? Agent-based AI. All of these things could lead to an increased use of AI by attackers, but we feel that APT groups will probably start using these sorts of techniques first, followed by other financially motivated criminals. So that is a little bit of a look at the threat landscape. Let's talk a little bit about what Rapid7 are doing to help our customers and organizations and partners. And so from an organization point of view, Rapid7 has two main areas of focus. The first is we help organizations manage their exposures, right? Traditionally, that's around vulnerability management, but that's kind of grown significantly. But we help organizations fundamentally manage their risk and exposures. Failing that, we help organizations to detect and respond to threats, right? If a threat does get in, we can help you detect it and respond. But we understood that to be able to do these two things well, you need to have really good visibility over your attack surface. And unfortunately, the reality is very few organizations understand their attack surface well. And so recently, we've been making a lot of investments, a lot of enhancements to be able to help organizations to manage their attack surface, and as a result of that, detect and respond to threats and to manage their exposures. And so we'll talk a little bit about the exposure management portfolio first. So when we think about exposure management, and Rob mentioned this previously, traditionally, Rapid7 has been known as a vulnerability management company. Now, vulnerability management is a really important part of your security strategy, right? When you look at all of the different frameworks, regulations, standards, whether it's NIST or ISO or PCI, they all call out vulnerability management. But there's a lot of problems with vulnerability management. And as we go through the sort of life cycle, I'm not going to talk about all the problems, but I'm going to talk about three, right? And the first is, to be able to do proper vulnerability management, you need to have a really good understanding of your environment. And in the old days, when our environments were static, there were workstations and servers, that was pretty easy, right? Now we've got cloud infrastructure that is spinning up and down. We've got applications that we have very little visibility into. So understanding that attack surface is really challenging. The second point is around vulnerabilities themselves, right? The prioritization of what's most important to you. As I mentioned, 40,000 new vulnerabilities last year. Who knows how many more vulnerabilities that are going to be discovered this year? How do you prioritize that to make sure that you're focusing on the most important things first, right? And then finally, we have this sort of concept of just trusting our vulnerability management process, right? We roll out a patch, we assume it works, job's closed, right? Or deal's done. But that's not necessarily the case. And so that validation piece is really missing as well. And then finally, reporting, I think, continues to be a challenge. I feel that we report quite often the wrong sort of metrics. We tell the board of directors how many critical vulnerabilities we fixed last week to this week. Those metrics are really kind of outdated as well. So these are some of the challenges of vulnerability management. So as a result of that, Gartner has come up with this new concept, right? Continuous Threat Exposure Management, or CTEM. And really, the way to think about CTEM is it's a little bit broader than vulnerability management, right? Vulnerability management is absolutely an important part of it, but it takes a much more practical approach. Instead of trying to fix everything, why don't you fix the things that most threats are targeting, right? So instead of just tidying up everything, let's focus our time and effort on the threats and the exposures that we know attackers are targeting first, right? And so that's kind of a bit of a reverse concept, which means a difference in prioritization. Now, there's actually 5 key pillars to this concept of continuous threat exposure management. The first is we need to have a very clear scope of what it is that we're trying to focus on. That's typically the attack surface. Once we know what that scope looks like, we have to discover and assess the assets for vulnerabilities and threats. We then need to prioritize those challenges and remediate them. We then need to validate to make sure that we've actually closed those gaps. And then finally, we want to mobilize the organization through reporting, through automation, to be able to make sure that we are covering off all of these sorts of threats. So that's, broadly speaking, the concept of CTEM. So where does Rapid7 fit in? Well, fortunately, for those of you who are familiar with Rapid7, you've kind of followed us over the years, we have been building out a portfolio over the last few years that started with vulnerability management, right? That started with the ability for us to identify vulnerabilities, to help you with compliance. But over time, we've kind of built that out with the ability to kind of detect and respond to your cloud threats, because your cloud assets requires a different way of thinking about assessment and vulnerability management. We've got application security to help you, again, with managing the vulnerabilities on your internally developed applications. To bring it all together, we've got a very strong SOAR capability, security orchestration, automation, and response. And then finally, and most recently, we acquired a new technology called Noetic that provides us with this attack surface management capability. And instead of having each of these individual pieces, which still exist today, we've pulled it all together into an offering that we call Exposure Command. And I'll talk a little bit about how Exposure Command maps out to that CTEM concept. So let's start with scoping, understanding the attack surface. Sometimes we think about understanding the attack surface as challenging because we don't have enough information, right? I would kind of think that actually one of the problems is we have too much information. When we ask, for example, most organizations, what is your single source of truth? What is the one place where you store all of your asset information? They kind of say, well, it depends, right? If you go and ask my vulnerability management team, they will tell you that I've got X number of assets. If you go and ask my CrowdStrike team, they'll say it's a different number. My Active Directory team thinks that I've got another set of numbers, and that kind of goes on and on and on, right? And fundamentally, really, where do we keep all this information? There's probably a spreadsheet somewhere that we can kind of pull out, right? So that concept of what that attack surface looks like is a challenge for all organizations. Not because we have not enough information, but because we have too much information, right? And so what we try and do is to bring all of this information together, which allows us to get a much clearer visibility of your threats, your vulnerabilities, and your controls, and present that to you in a meaningful way through the Surface Command capability, right? It pulls in all the information from all the tools that you're currently using and shows you all of that information in a single place. Once we know what that asset attack surface looks like, we can then start to enumerate as well as to assess them for vulnerabilities, right? On top of kind of all the information that you pull together, we also understand that your external attack surface probably changes on a very regular basis, and you can't necessarily rely on some of the existing tools that you have. And so we have this concept of external attack surface management capability. So we're scanning your external environment. We are crawling through the different websites and domains to tell you about new changes to your external attack surface. So once we know what your attack surface looks like, we can then assess them for vulnerabilities. And that's really where the traditional Rapid7 inside VM capability comes in for all of your on-prem environments and your remote. We have agent-based as well as agent-less capabilities to assess them for vulnerabilities. But we also understand that for your cloud environments and your cloud assets, you need a different way of assessing them because these things are what we call ephemeral. They spin up, they spin down. You can't rely on a regular scheduled scan to be able to pick them up, right? So we have the ability also to help organizations to understand their risk posture in the cloud. The next step is around the prioritization point of view. And because we have this on-prem and cloud capability, we can pull all of that information together into a single capability that we've called the Remediation Hub. So the Remediation Hub is a single place where you can go to and you can say, what do I need to do first to be able to reduce as much risk as possible, right? So it's a way for you to prioritize all of the different kind of vulnerabilities based on the threats that are out there and based on the severity of your assets or the criticality of your assets as well. Now, from when we talk about cloud has a very different concept of risk. Because with cloud, it's not so much about the vulnerabilities, it's about the potential misconfiguration, right? Because cloud environments tend to be very complex. They're not less secure, but they tend to be a lot more complex, and it's very hard to understand exactly what the effective level of access is to an attacker. And so we have this ability to map out the attack paths for your cloud environments to show you that if I've got this one small asset exposed on the internet, maybe this leads to a much bigger threat within the organization itself. So that's the attack path side of things. And also for your web applications, we have the ability for you to assess them dynamically to be able to highlight any sort of challenges within that web application environment as well. And then finally, mobilization. So with mobilization, that's talking about, first of all, is pulling that information together so that you have a single view of your attack surface. Also the ability, because the challenge with vulnerability management is that quite often the people or the team responsible for identifying the vulnerabilities is not the same team that fixes them, right? So you need to be able to mobilize and assign tasks and goals and SLAs to the various teams that are responsible for the applications, for patching your workstation servers, patching your infrastructure. So that concept is built in. And then finally, we also understand that Rapid7 is not going to be the only tool that you're using. And so security orchestration, automation, and response, it's extremely important for you to be able to build workflows, complex workflows, and orchestration capabilities. And so we have that ability built into our Exposure Command offering through integrations with over 300 different technology partners and growing. Now, did anyone spot the step that I missed in all of this? So I spoke about 5 steps in the C10 program. What about validation, right? We didn't talk about validation. So I would like to introduce to you a brand new service capability that we have just introduced, and that's called Vector Command. Vector Command is a brand new continuous red team service that we are now offering. And so Rapid7 has always had a very, very strong team of penetration testers who work on ad hoc engagements. Through the use of their expertise, as well as a combination of additional technology, we've built this new service that's designed to give our customers a number of different benefits. The first is it allows you to see your environment from an attacker's perspective. So our team are constantly looking at your environment, looking for potential weaknesses independently of the controls that you've got within the environment. When we find any of these sorts of challenges, we will then go in and actually test the controls, right? So we will try and validate whether or not your controls are working. If we find a vulnerability, we will try and exploit it. If we find certain weaknesses in certain controls, we will try and make use of that misconfiguration, fundamentally with the goal of being able to improve your cybersecurity posture over time, right? How do we do this? Well, throughout the year, we use a number of different techniques. And so this is not like a traditional pen test engagement where you know exactly when it's coming. It's a very set scope. This is really an ongoing process that we do throughout the term of the subscription. And so we will do opportunistic phishing. We will set up phishing attacks. We will assess your external network, of course. We will try and simulate a breach, right? If we find a threat, then we will try and compromise that. And also, we will test your controls against our latest emergent threat responses. So these are the highest risk threat campaigns that we are tracking. And finally, we of course provide you with very regular reporting, either monthly reporting or ad hoc reporting if we do find some challenges. And so that is the new Vector Command offering. And with that, hopefully you can see that through a combination of both Exposure Command and Vector Command, that gets you much closer to that CTEM experience rather than just a standalone vulnerability management program. So let's now pivot to the second area that Rapid7 focuses on, which is detection and response. And so when we think about, for most organizations, how do you detect and respond to threats, or who detects and responds to threats for you? Generally, the answer that we get back is the SOC, right? You rely on a SOC and the SOC functions. But building a SOC and managing a SOC is becoming harder and harder all the time, right? When we think about all of the different specialized skills, and they are very specialized skills, and you think about all the different technology, and you think about all the different people that you need, it starts to get pretty unmanageable, right? All of the tools to provide that core SOC operation also then needs to be enhanced through what Gartner now calls expanded SOC operations, right? So to be a really effective SOC, you also need to have threat intelligence, you also need to have breach simulation, and with that, that's a whole different set of tools, a whole different set of skills. And so having all of these capabilities is very hard for most organizations, which is why managed detection and response has become one of the fastest growing cybersecurity services available, right? This is a type of service that provides a huge amount of value to most organizations who can't manage their own SOC. And the main reason why it's so valuable is because in a single solution, it includes the people, the process, and technology to detect and respond to threats. Now, Rapid7 has actually been a pioneer in this area. We've been in the managed detection response space for the last 10 years or so. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about how we're enhancing our service a little bit more. So the first thing that a traditional MDR does is that it captures all of the different customer signals that you have. Well, some of them do, right? Some of them only provide you with an EDR agent. But what we have announced recently is the ability for our MDR service, also known as Managed Threat Complete, or MTC, to be able to triage additional third-party event sources, right? So regardless of whether you're using Microsoft Defender or CrowdStrike or SentinelOne endpoints, or soon to be announced Palo Alto Cortex, we will be able to triage those event sources within the SOC. We will also be able to triage a number of different cloud and user event sources, including Entra ID sources, and we will be announcing more third-party event sources to come. The second thing is around the tools themselves, right? Now, as a Managed Threat Complete solution, we also provide our customers with the SIEM and XDR capability. But one of the main limitations with a SIEM is that data is expensive, right? And so organizations have this sort of conundrum. Do I send all my security data into the SIEM, which I know it needs to be able to see all the threats, but how do I balance that against the cost? And so we take away that problem for you by providing an unlimited amount of data ingestion, right? So you can push as much data as you want into the SIEM as part of the MTC service. And on top of that, we also provide not just that XDR and SIEM capability, but additional tools that we know you need to be able to be more effective against the latest threats, including the vulnerability management platform, including the SOAR platform, as well as Velociraptor, which is a digital forensics and incident response tool, right? So that is the technology side of things. Let's talk a little bit about the people. So the people really comes from the SOC. Rapid7 has built 4 security operations centers around the world, and we've enhanced that capability with in a number of different ways. The first and foremost, right, and we believe that this is a really, really important differentiator for us, access to Rapid7 Labs data, right? Again, we have a massive community of researchers and the open source community that are sharing information with us all the time. And so we're building that intelligence into our MDR service offering. The second, and as Rob mentioned, AI, right? So we continue to use AI to be able to detect new threats, to be able to create new signatures, to be able to build new training models to make our SOC a lot more effective. The third, and I think this is a really important one, is this transparent partnership, which is a model that we've always supported. And that is that you as a customer have full access to that MDR platform at all times. You see what our SOC sees. You can correspond with the analyst in real time. You can see why they've closed certain alerts, why they've left certain alerts open. And so the reason why we want to do that is because we want to make sure that you're also upskilling your own capability as well, right? So you're learning from the SOC, you're building your own capabilities, and you're getting much more value out of that partnership. And then finally, another key differentiator is unlimited incident response, right? So because we believe that this is a true partnership model, what we try and do is, regardless of any incidents, and we certainly hope that you're not going to get too many incidents or any incidents, but if you do get attacked, we will work with you for as long as it takes, as much as it takes to be able to contain that threat with you, right? So unlimited incident response is a really big differentiator. And then finally, let's talk about processes. Let's talk about exactly what sort of services you get. The reality is that threat detection is no longer enough. And so as part of the extended coverage capability, we also enable our customers to add on additional modules or capabilities. A very, very popular one, for example, is dark web monitoring. So if you want us to monitor the dark web for you, we can do that and notify you through our managed DRP offering. We've also got, for example, Service Command. So if you want visibility over your attack surface, you can add that on to the subscription. If you want that continuous red teaming, you can also add that on to the subscription, hopefully giving you a much more well-rounded experience from an MDR perspective. And so we've spoken a lot. This is really the last slide that I've got. In summary, what we know is that the threat landscape continues to be very, very challenging. We've spoken about APT groups. We've spoken about ransomware groups. The reality is, because there is so much funding that goes into these criminal operations, they are very, very well resourced. That's why we're starting to see a lot of kind of innovation in this sort of space. But the innovation itself isn't even necessary because we're still struggling with some basic security hygiene. You know, whether it's patch management, whether it's multi-factor authentication, whether it's user education, right? All of these things are still areas that we really need to be focusing on. To help you with that, Rapid7 has two key offerings. Our exposure management offering that we continue to enhance, because now the conversation has kind of moved from vulnerability management to the concept of continuous threat exposure management, focusing on the threats rather than just on the vulnerabilities. And then finally, for those of you who struggle with managing your own detection response program, we do have a very, very comprehensive offering as well through our Managed Threat Complete solution. And so with that, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you listening.